So today we're going to talk about the SAT versus the ACT a bit, and then we're going to look at some differences, the timelines about testing and college applications and admissions, and some expectations and just how they've changed over the past few years. My name is Tal Kitron. I work with Applerouth Tutoring. I've been with the company for almost 10 years now in various capacities. Right now, my job is full-time online tutor. I teach PSAT, SAT, ACT prep, and a couple other subjects. Let's get into it. If you have questions, please do put them in the Q&A. I will leave some time at the end to answer. Probably won't get to many of them as we go, but I definitely try to save some time at the end. So if you've got any questions come up, feel free to shoot them my way. We're going to talk about testing and the ACT, SAT, and its role in college admissions. It's important to put this in context. So I always tell all my students, test scores do not define you. They are an important part of the application and admissions process, but they are not the be-all, end-all. You can see here grades, especially in core classes, and strength of schedule, academic rigor, are often weighted more heavily than test scores. We also see things like essays, personal statements, demonstrated interest by going on tours and showing your interest in a college. Those are all huge factors as well. So just placing all of this in context, there are other factors that influence admissions decisions, indeed some more than test scores, but of course, SAT, ACT, college entrance exams are a very important part, even still. Broad strokes, the difference between SAT and ACT, the SAT is more rigorous reading-wise, and really just a harder test in general. Critical thinking, analytical, evidence-based questions, harder passages. The ACT, on the other hand, has more rigorous STEM content. So there is a science section, which isn't really science, it's interpreting graphs. And then math is more questions in less time and just harder stuff, covers a wider spectrum of things. So SAT tough for reading, ACT tough for math. That's very broad strokes because they really have a ton of overlap. About 80% of the content does overlap. It is important to decide on one test and focus on it. But in the rare circumstances where students have to switch from ACT to SAT or vice versa, there is overlap, right? It's not like you're starting anew. They both test comprehension, both test grammar skills and rhetoric. SAT has graph reading on all sections. There isn't a science section, but there are graphs throughout. And they both have some algebra, some statistics, some geometry in various capacities. ACT more advanced science and data interpretation and math. SAT more word problems, more advanced reading. Structurally very, very similar these days. There are some changes coming, which we'll discuss. But as of right now, they're about the same amount of time. The SAT has done away with the essay portion, so that no longer exists. Writing is just grammar and rhetoric. The ACT still has an essay that's optional, but there are very, very few colleges which require it. So it's pretty much gone by the wayside. But you can see SAT starts with reading, nice long reading section, and then writing, short math, and then a longer math with calculator. The ACT starts with English, then math, and then two very fast-paced sections at the end of reading and science. Both tests will give what's called an experimental section 5, which I just warn my students about that it's a thing. It does not affect your score out of 1600 or out of 36. It's to gather data for future tests. So it's 4 sections for each test that matter, and just those first 4 up there. Notice the big difference with ACT is that there's a science section, whereas SAT sprinkles graphs throughout. Time per question is a really huge difference. The ACT is breakneck speed. It's all about speed, which some people really don't like. A lot of people prefer the SAT just because it's a bit more forgiving timing-wise. You can see there, I mean, almost 30 to 45% more time per question on average on SAT over ACT. Now, the ACT is simpler, so sometimes we can get through those questions more quickly and still feel confident. But again, it's a really big time crunch, especially on those reading and science sections. The SAT, as of the switch in 2015 to its current version, is big on Common Core skills. So what I always tell people, you got to know a lot about a little. You need to understand equations of a line and functions and zeros and intercepts and factoring and all that stuff really well for SAT. For ACT, you just need to know a little bit about a lot. They'll give you a question where it's like, hey, do you know what a matrix is? Here's a point. Ever heard of logarithms? Here's another point. Whereas the SAT will be much more in depth on a certain topic in algebra. We've got on SAT is interpreting over solving. So it's going to be what am I solving for rather than the tough math. More applied math, so they'll give you variables or word problems and you have to translate that. Lots of overlapping content, meaning the SAT has a ton of algebra and it comes back over and over. Same skills of like factoring, foiling, substituting, isolating, and then more reading intensive. So both tests have word problems, but the SAT is a bit trickier, has more word problems on math. ACT doesn't hide the ball. They have calculator section throughout, so no calc. There are also only multiple choice questions on ACT math, whereas the SAT offers free response questions. But the ACT gives you 5 choices, not 4. So that's a little bit harder. It's very rule-based. Again, it's just kind of like, hey, have you ever heard of this? Concepts in isolation, like a vector or a function or something else, perpendicular lines. You can use up to pretty much any calculator, but a graphing calculator is definitely near a must-have on these tests. And as we said, broader range of concepts. So you can expect some pre-calc and trig type stuff that you might not get on SAT. As far as content, so just a little more on these tests, and then we'll get into the impact on admissions and just kind of how we think about these. But you can see one of the big differences is ACT has a lot of geometry. Of course, the SAT gives formulas for geometry and then almost never tests it. The ACT doesn't give formulas and then tests it all the time. Trig is mostly going to be SOHCAHTOA and simple trig, but you see more of that on ACT than SAT. SAT is an algebra test. Last bit on math is that the ACT just has a lot of challenging concepts, especially towards the end. Questions do tend to get harder as they go on all math sections. So things that people often haven't seen much of or at all is hyperbolas and ellipses and what the equation is, memorizing equation of a circle in a coordinate plane. Understanding domain and certain x values that can't be true for a function. Asymptotes, which is something that people often learn in pre-calc. Radians to degrees. And then the last 2 things here are just vocab words that almost nobody would know or remember. So like knowing what a monomial factor is, or at least not getting psyched out if you see that, or the associative and commutative properties of addition or multiplication, which isn't something that people should have on the tip of their tongue or need to know, but in the ACT, 1 of 60 questions out of nowhere might ask about that. Right? So for math whizzes, that's no problem. Some people find that troubling. Practically, which test should you try first? Both. Every time I start with a student, the first thing is let's take a mock SAT and mock ACT, unless they for some reason know which test they want, but take one of each, compare the results, right? If the ACT is much stronger, you do that. If the SAT is much stronger, you do that. If they're about the same, then go with what we liked better, because people will do better with what they enjoy. And once in a blue moon, you'll work for a month or 2 and just the scores won't be moving. And we realize, I don't like this test. Something's not clicking. If you do have to switch content transfers, that is rare. You want to, after you decide which test you're going for, you want to register for 2 to 3 official tests on sat.org or act.org and prepare for those, right? So if I'm doing a tutoring package with a student, I'm working backwards, like for now, maybe the December SAT and the SAT. So I want sessions to lead into both those tests seamlessly. So the student goes in with confidence, with momentum, feeling good for each official test and getting multiple cracks at it. And we'll talk about why. Schedules, I mean, junior year, which is when oftentimes people are taking this test, is insane. I don't need to tell most of you. It's just people, especially if they've got extracurriculars or sports or music, there's just not much time for this stuff. So plan it out ahead of time. Think about when can you take these practice tests and decide on a test. We talked about if you're clearly stronger, go with your strength. But the other thing to think about is which official tests are you targeting? And that might rely on your sports schedule or just what time of year it is. You want to plan on taking the official test 2 or 3 times. Most students take 3 tests to reach full potential. There have been quite a few that get it on the second test. It's really rare to be one and done. It also puts unfair pressure. You don't want to go into the first test thinking, I got to get my score here. You want to go into the first test thinking, this is low pressure. I've got more cracks at it down the road. That's when you tend to see a great first test, is if you know you've got multiple tests down the road. And the best way to learn is sit for a real test. As far as which test to take, there are some myths out there, but none of them have any merit from what we've seen. In other words, it is not better to take November over June or May over August. They're all graded on a curve. The curve for each test depends on who took it that day and who took that same form, and they just curve it across the board. There's just no real benefits taking one test or another, except that October, March, and May for SAT, you can get the results back. So for October, March, and May, right after you take the test, you can actually get the answers that you missed right back online, whereas you can't do that for the other ones. So I love October SAT because of that as a good first test. But other than that, just think about your schedule and just when are you going to have the most bandwidth, right? You always have to go into a test rested, healthy, and without something urgent coming up directly after. What are the elements to successful prep? So mock tests, practice tests to begin is really important because you know which tests to look at and where your focus areas need to be. Distributed practice means this is not your typical test that you can cram for or just like learn a lot in one sitting. It's a test of effort, not intelligence. You have to kind of start early and space things out and then reinforce it down the road, right? This is a marathon, not a sprint. Want to spend a good amount of time on tasks, both in session and out of session, making mistakes so you can learn from them. We talked about working backwards from the test date, finishing strong always. So we need momentum going in. And then setting a goal. I always work on that early with students because everyone's goal is different and you can't answer what's a good SAT score. There's no answer to that. So we think about where am I starting? Where do I want to go to school? What's realistic? And it's good to set high goals, but we want to set something achievable so that we can see the progress and feel like we're getting there. What we're going to get to now is the meat of the presentation, which is a highly simplified testing plan. So this is really just logistics and hopefully will be helpful if people are starting to think about this, but unsure where to begin. Here are the test dates each year domestically. I'll leave this up on screen for a moment. Notice the asterisks by test dates where you can get the question and answers back. Again, October, March, and May SATs are really nice ones because you get them back immediately online, like 10 days later. The ACT sends them by mail, and that's only in April, June, December. Still helpful, but marginally so, because it takes a couple months, so it's less of a good resource for the next test. Great way to do this would be if you are a rising junior, you're just starting junior year. High scorers should be taking probably the October SAT, PSAT, and then maybe one more in November and December, or 2 more ideally. And you can be done fall semester. Others want to start in the spring, and maybe we do like the March SAT as the first test because you get results back, and then use those for May, and if needed, one more in June or in August if June's busy with finals and APs. What's changing with the SAT? A couple things from last year. So subject tests are no more. This was something that people took at the end of the year, like APs for college credit. They've done away with them. APs took over. And the SAT writing portion also no longer exists. Mercifully, it is not something we have to do anymore. This will affect freshmen, not sophomores. So 9th graders right now will experience a change in the PSAT next year and the SAT the following year. And the changes are major. It's going computer-based. It's going to be a shorter test, 2 hours, not 3. Even less of a time crunch than it already is. And the SAT is not a big time crunch right now compared to ACT. And then shorter reading passages, including passages that only have one question per passage. No calculator section. Still out of 1600. And probably we'll see more in-school testing, meaning because it's computer-based, there's just going to be more flexibility. So you should see a lot more of those April in-school tests. ACT is also rumored to make some changes, but they've been kind of waylaid. So we had an announcement a couple of years ago that the ACT was changing to computer-based. Internationally, everyone who takes an ACT does it on a computer. That's been the case for several years. Domestically, not. But they've said that's coming. And they've also said something super exciting, which is taking section by section. So you can go in on one test day and just take science, or go in on one day and just take math. That's really important for super scoring and for students who take a test and just feel like, oh, this one section didn't go how I wanted it to. It's hard to predict this. I would say they've removed everything from the website after announcing it. So apparently there's some delays. I don't think this is imminent, but it could really happen almost whenever. SAT and ACT are always making changes to keep up with one another. So they'll probably end up being implemented around the same time if I had to guess. But major delays on these changes so far. I mentioned super scoring. What that means is that many colleges, I would say vast majority super score SAT, maybe about half super score the ACT. That means if you take multiple tests, they will only see the highest section scores across multiple test sittings. So you can see this person's super score has a math and science score from April, but it's got an English and reading score from September, December, respectively. Super scored colleges won't see how many times you took the test or like which scores were on which tests. The nice thing as of last year is also that super scores can be auto-generated. So for a college that does accept super scores, the ACT, you only have to send one, you don't have to send a bunch. So cheaper and easier. The test optional Tsunami, so some big changes recently. The 4 main types of admissions policies for colleges are test required, test optional, test flexible, and test blind. Test required is returning to some states. So what happened when COVID hit was pretty much everywhere went to test optional. I was having students who would be signed up for SATs, and then a week before it'd be canceled, test centers were closing, it was just not possible. So almost every college went test optional, meaning you could submit an SAT, ACT if you had one that you liked, or you could also submit an application without a test score. In Florida and Georgia, it's already kind of come back. The flagship schools require SAT or ACT now when you apply. North Carolina delayed it, but I believe also has started either as of this year or next year. So in the South, slowly coming back to requiring those admissions tests. MIT, Georgetown, and some other highly selective schools are rumored to join, but these schools have also gone from test optional back to requiring the test. So everyone who applies to these schools must submit an ACT or SAT score. What does it mean if a school's test optional? So I will say as a tutor, I mean, I know there are flaws with the standardized testing process and it's far from perfect, but I was a little worried when this test optional thing happened that people would just stop taking the tests. And I will say those fears were unfounded. The rule with test optional is that colleges can consider applications complete even if you don't submit a test score. They'll get some applications with test scores, SAT, ACT, some without. If they receive the test scores, of course, they'll review it. So those are all in one pool. And then they'll also have another pool of students who didn't submit scores. So just considered in a separate pool, but also considered. And as we said, test optional is by far the dominant position since pandemic began. This past admissions cycle, over 1,800 schools, more than 3/4 of all colleges and universities were test optional, almost double in like 2019, the 1,000 schools that were test optional. And a lot of the really selective colleges and universities that we know of made this switch. So previously did require tests, now do not. As and after we return to some semblance of normalcy, it's going to stay this way. Test optional is here to stay. We're pretty confident about that. We'll get into what it means. Right now, only 5% of schools you apply to on the Common App require testing. These are some of them. You see a lot of Georgia and Florida, and then just Georgetown. And there's a few more that have been added to this list maybe over the past year or so. But that's not that many. I mean, that's a pretty small percentage that require testing. A couple years ago, they did this study, Ernst & Young and Parthenon estimated that in about 2024, 2025, 70-ish% of schools would be test optional and 20 to 30% will require it. That 20 to 30% number seems too high. There probably will not be that many schools that go back to requiring testing. It'll be more like 10, 15% maybe. Most of the schools are going to remain test optional, so you have the option to submit SAT, ACT scores or the option not to. Because conditions aren't yet normal, I still have seen test centers cancel late and things just aren't yet back to normal. A lot of colleges just are waiting to make decisions. So they're getting a lot more applications. They have to figure out how to deal with that. Figuring out also like measurements of success. So with test optional admissions, when test scores aren't there to show predictors of performance, is GPA a good predictor? Is a high school with a high graduation rate a good predictor? So admissions offices have to be more thoughtful, and they're just holding off making permanent changes until we have more data, which makes a lot of sense. A lot of them want to see several years worth. And again, what do yield rates look like? So if I'm accepting 60% of my class who takes the SAT, ACT, 40% of incoming freshmen don't, they want to see how they're doing, right? Or is there some definite correlation between test takers and success, right? Or vice versa. I talked about the South. So Florida never stopped requiring those tests, even though almost everywhere did. A big thing with test scores is also not just in the South, but a lot of places have tied SAT, ACT to merit scholarships. And there are some scholarships that you just can't get unless you have a test score. So that's pretty crucial. Some really huge scholarships that you just have no chance at unless you've taken an SAT or ACT. And then Rick Clark at Georgia Tech has mentioned that a lot of state systems in the South are probably going to reinstate. We've seen Georgia, we've seen North Carolina, so the rest will follow. For the next few years, Harvard's going to stay test optional, so talking about holding off making permanent decisions. They're going to have that full 4 years to get a graduating class, look for the differential in performance across test submitters, those who took ACT, SAT and sent them in, and those who didn't. It's Harvard, so colleges will follow that lead. There's some Supreme Court rulings coming up, and who knows when and what will happen, but testing requirements, there have been a lot of things in the past where people, like colleges like UC system, has decided they were going to come up with a new way to measure or standardize college admission. And so something other than SAT, ACT. I don't think that's imminent, but it's just worth monitoring because the test landscape could change with some sort of big Supreme Court decision. That's always true. Big thing is test optional does not mean test blind. So most people, when they're applying to test optional colleges and universities, the majority of students who are getting in are still submitting test scores. And if anything, it's gotten more competitive. So because it's optional now, people are thinking, man, I got to really get a really good score to submit it. So those students who are submitting scores, they tend to be on average, maybe a little bit stronger than they used to be. And I mean, I will say again, it's imperfect, but test scores are how to standardize a student. A 4.0 at one school in Seattle is not the same as a 4.0 at some random school, not some other school in another state, right, in Nashville. So it's very hard to compare two students just based on GPA or even schedule. But those SAT scores and ACT scores, I mean, they're graded on a curve. It's easy to compare, right? Not perfect, but simpler. So of course, colleges still consider standardized test results among predictors of success. Here are some schools that went test blind, meaning they don't accept test scores. You can't submit an SAT or ACT. And so you see not many big schools, but Caltech, Washington State. You also see the whole UC system. So UCLA, UC Berkeley, UC Santa Barbara, all those you can't submit a test score for, right? So those are not ACT, SAT colleges anymore. But you can see it's a pretty short list. And we mentioned that not submitting test scores. So let's say you have the option to submit or not. We mentioned that some scholarships are tied to SAT or ACT scores. So for example, Alabama here. Total tuition for out-of-staters is $30,000 and change for a year at Alabama. But look at these scholarships. Anything from the capstone to the presidential, notice that all of them have an SAT or ACT score involved. So even if you've got a 4.0 and everything's great, you're not even eligible for any of these scholarships, which are pretty significant scholarships, unless you've taken ACT or SAT and submitted it with your application. So that's a Southern school, but we do see that. Scholarships tied to standardized tests. A few others here, Utah State. If you have this certain benchmark of ACT, SAT score and at least a 3.0, automatic awards. So guaranteed scholarships. University of Georgia has done something similar for years. Texas Tech, same thing. High school rank, but also test scores. Need to have the test scores up to 9,000 per year. And you can see Lake Forest College, same thing as Utah State. Certain benchmark of ACT, SAT, 3.0 GPA, you're going to get a guaranteed merit scholarship. Mentioned Georgia. This has gotten a lot harder to get over the years, and Georgia's just gotten more and more competitive and a great school. But the Zell Miller covers tuition at state universities in Georgia for Georgia residents. If you've got these benchmarks of 3.7 GPA or higher, these minimum scores of 1,200 or 26 on ACT in one sitting, not super scored, and then you have to maintain a certain level in college to keep the scholarship. But again, you don't need a very, very competitive SAT or ACT score. Like those are 80th percentile, pretty good, but not like elite to receive scholarships. So sometimes even if you're not an elite test taker, it pays to take the test, literally. And I imagine questions probably came up around that. If you do have any, shoot them in there. We're gonna have some time at the end for questions. Something that Test Optional did big time was it popped the application numbers. It made a lot more people apply. So the joke, for example, at Stanford is they're trying to get down to 0% admissions, and it's even gotten worse. It's just not doubling, but schools have like 50% increases in how many students applied, because maybe I would think, well, if I don't have a perfect test score, I can't get into Harvard or Yale or Stanford. But all of a sudden they're test optional and everything else I've got is great. I've got this perfect GPA, I'm a hard worker, but I just don't have the test scores, but I don't have to submit them. I can go in this other pool. So a lot more people would apply, many more applicants to these elite schools and just selective schools. It makes colleges not sure because they always have to offer many more students a spot than who will actually matriculate and come to that college. So it's been a tough guessing game for colleges of how many do we accept. Because of that, I've seen more wait lists in the past 2 years than ever. And I've actually seen more people come off of wait lists than ever. So longer wait lists and just people coming on and off it. Early decision is replacing early action as a yield management tool, meaning a lot of colleges are taking a lot more people from early decision, which is a commitment by the applicant I'm going to apply early, and if I get in, I'm going to this place. It's like a contract. And so early decision, you really got to know where you want to go and be very confident because you're committing as you apply. But for colleges, it's a nice tool because it gives them a lot more definite sense of how many people will be there this next semester, right? So they can guarantee a decent chunk of their incoming class. More applicants means lower percent of admission. And some of these are pretty significant. I mean, from 2019, you can see Emory dropped 6%. Duke got cut in half. UGA went down quite a bit, right? So all these schools that were already fairly selective have now become even more so. I mentioned early decision. Look at some of these numbers. They're pretty incredible. Penn and Emory filled over half of their class with early decision. Barnard and Tulane filled closer to 60%. Duke filled over half. So that means that half of the freshman class is already accounted for before the normal application cycle, which is where most of the students apply. So, I mean, the impact is if you're a senior and you're thinking, man, I'm running late, and it's never too late. So don't panic, right? Early decision certainly is not for everyone by any means. I didn't apply early decision anywhere. But it is becoming a bigger thing. So if you're a sophomore, junior, or parents of or guardians of sophomores and juniors, you want to think about this as like, is there somewhere where I'm pretty set on and would be comfortable applying early decision? It just gives you a lot better chance this day and age when there's a lot more variability. So definitely worth looking into and talking with college counselors about early decision, early action versus regular applications. At Cornell, they've mentioned that if you do submit an application with no testing, no SAT, ACT, everything else gets a bit of heightened scrutiny. Meaning, if you don't have SAT, ACT, they'll take a closer look at your GPA and your schedule and your depth of experience and commitment to pursuing other experiences, AP exams and other benchmark tests, personal statements and essays that you've written, recommendations, which are big. Start asking for those now, right? So yeah, I think that's something to keep in mind as you are applying to test optional school without a test. You can bet that this stuff will be more heavily looked at, which for some people is the goal, right? They want this to be their highlight of their application. Some interesting numbers as far as who submits. So for Common App, fewer than half of students using the Common App now are submitting scores. Part of that, though, has to do with strategic submission. So maybe I've got 6 colleges I'm applying to on the Common App, but my score is good enough for a couple of them for sure, and maybe not for others. So I don't want to submit my ACT on the Common App if it's going to go to all 6 schools. I'll send it individually to the 2 I want to send it, but my Common application won't have a score on it. So even though that's a big decrease, it doesn't mean that like per school, they're seeing that kind of drop. I don't think that's probably not true. I will say that testing has always been, but has become more important in the science and math world. So because there are more males than females in the STEM universe, we have seen more male students, higher percentage, submitting scores than female students. And that mostly just has to do with on average choice of majors. I think that number will probably switch from year to year, but right now that's the theme, is that larger percentage of male students are submitting scores than female students. What used to be the case is you would take a test or two and you would pretty much send it or not. I mean, it's like if tests usually was either required or the school didn't really look at them. But for most colleges that required ACT, SAT, you would just submit them. And so there are only 4% of students who would decide between colleges, here I will submit, here I will not. Now about a quarter of students are deciding, I will submit my ACT score to this college, but I will not submit it to that one because I don't think it helps my portfolio here, but it does boost my chances at this university. So being strategic about where you're submitting, where you're not. Here, what we see is across the board, whether it's private or public, selective or not so much, what we saw in 2020 is lower submission rates, meaning fewer students who applied submitted test scores. It used to be 70, 80, 90% of people would submit test scores. Now it's anywhere from 40 to 65, huge difference, right? So that's something that the test optional world has definitely changed, right? So a lot fewer people now submitting tests. We talked about STEM students trying to showcase their quantitative abilities through testing. So this is just statistics from one public university. They said 59% of people who got in submitted test scores, but of those who got in, 75% of the engineering students who were in had ACT or SAT. 55% of business, but then fewer than half of education, social work, general, liberal arts majors, stuff like that. The SAT, ACT doesn't matter. It's not as big an indicator of success either. So differential rates of submission based on major. And I mean, a couple questions that come up. One is, did test score submitters have an edge? Short answer is yes. Big time. This data is now kind of hard to come by. So this is a couple years ago, because like I said, colleges are trying to not make any decisions or draw public scrutiny. So hard to find this a lot. Like that's one of the biggest challenges right now, is going back a couple of years and trying to get a full picture of what it looks like now. But taking a look at the advantage, I mean, you can see here in some schools, there was almost a double advantage or likelihood to getting into a school if you did submit scores. It makes sense for a STEM-focused college like Georgia Tech to admit far more students with scores, because they put a big emphasis on ACT math or SAT math, right? But even Emory, it's doubled, right? So it used to be about, so it's 17% who take tests. So of the students who got in, 70% of them who submit tests get in, whereas those people who don't submit tests, only 8% get in. So again, I mean, there are different things to look at and different factors. It's not directly cause and effect, but I definitely think there's an obvious correlation here. So yes, there's an advantage to submitting SAT, ACT within reason. Next question that comes up is, should I even try the test? And again, the short answer is yes. Applerouth offers, and we do some practice test weekends, but it's always easy to get either a free or very low cost mock test. We have in-person ones in Atlanta and Seattle and other locations. You can also just take them in home online with a Zoom proctor or on your own. And that's something that is definitely the first move. So no matter what, whether you're doing test prep with a tutor or just by yourself or not at all, take an SAT and ACT and figure out which test is better for you. Right? Again, if the scores are close to what a college is looking for, so maybe you already have your eye on Clemson, and you take the baseline scores and your scores are just way below what they're looking for. So like this is your middle range and your score is way out there. I would say this is rare, but if you really feel like no way I can get to that range, then don't do it. You're going to be in the test optional pool. Take SAT, ACT off your plate. But if you take a baseline test and you're like, okay, here's where I need to be, set that goal, most people should still be taking these tests. It's still quite competitive. So you want to at least take them as a baseline to see which one you like better. And if you think that testing is for you, then yeah, most people should try them and then plan out 2 to 3 official tests. That's still the name of the game these days, for better and for worse. Then the question becomes, when we apply to colleges, should we send our test scores in? We talked about strategic submission. The questions are, well, will this add value to your application? Be logical, right? So like, if I look at the middle range of students who got in last year, or maybe 2 years ago if the data is not available, and my score is right in that range, I'll probably send it. If it's above that range, I'll definitely send it. And if it's below, I don't know if I want the admissions office to see that. Will it really help my application or not? That's the question, right? Will they add value, or am I better off without sending these? Some opinions, some thoughts. This again mentions the STEM. So at one public university, it wasn't a big difference. Whether you submitted SAT or not, pretty similar admission rates, except in STEM and business, which probably outweighed a lot of stuff. And there it said students who do submit test scores got in at higher rates. So if you're thinking engineering or science or math, more likely that you're going to need to take these tests and perform well. I think Sean Felton here is being generous here. He says if you were pressed to give a threshold for SAT math or SAT verbal, he'd say don't submit unless it's 650 or higher. But if you look at the range, and this is available online for almost every college, you go Cornell, middle quartile SAT or ACT, and you'll see that from the 25th to the 75th percentile, so half of the students who got in the middle range were in this higher score range of 680 to 760 or 720 to 800. So I think you got to really think about that, right? 650, depending on your major, might not be worth sending. You might be better off just saying, no, I'm going to go test optional and not send, right? So hard to know. This person's saying 650 or higher, and this is someone who's looking at test scores most days. So I hate to quibble with it, but I do think this would be a really hard decision, right? If I got a 700 on verbal, I'm feeling great, right? 750 on math, definitely sending. But if I'm right at the bottom part of that 25th percentile range, maybe not. Maybe I wouldn't send. Right, those are the tough decisions. And again, like STEM versus fine arts or music, test scores below average in those might not hurt. In fact, if you are applying for a fine arts major and you've got a decent test score, but maybe not like otherworldly, maybe it's better to send because it shows a bit more rigor and maybe it'll set you apart from other applicants who didn't submit scores. And it might just not matter as much for that major, one way or the other. Sorry for the little formatting issue here, but go with your strengths. So again, if you're at upper 50%, so above 50% of people who got in the prior year, submit it, absolutely. If it's representative of you and you feel like it's like, this is gonna help me, send it. And again, if it's in the bottom quartile, don't. Showcase your strengths. So don't send the scores if they're below the normal range. GPA is also a factor in decision to submit or not submit test scores. If you are taking all the AP classes and you've got this perfect GPA and your class rank is very high, but your test scores are just average, which we do see a lot. Some people just don't love the test taking or just doesn't click. I think we've kind of established it, but if you have average scores for tests and everything else is stellar, you may not want to submit those scores. Most people, about 2/3, do have grades that align with testing. But if your test scores are below, don't submit. If they're way above, you might get a big boost. For me, my grades were always fine, not amazing, but my test scores were high, which helped me when I applied to colleges, both with getting in and with scholarships. This will come into play hugely if the ACT ever actually does the individual sections, but no matter what, I will say that not all 1400s are created equal. Meaning, if you're applying to STEM engineering and you have 800 math, but your verbal's lower, that 1400 is nice. Versus if it's flipped, might not submit it because 600 math is probably well below a lot of math students at that engineering program. So do think about breakdown. Again, not all 1400s or 1500s or 1200s are created equal. And the baseline with all this is you can't unsee a weak score. So if you kind of know in your heart of hearts that this score is not representative of your ability, or it doesn't put you in a good position for this college you're applying to, you can't unsee it. So it can make people think, well, why was the score so low? Right? So if you have the option not to send a weak score, you just won't send it. I think that's straightforward. College counselors can help with that. Folks at Applerouth, we've got a really good team. I work with my students a lot on that. Just even though we're tutoring for ACT, SAT, we do talk about that kind of thing and just being strategic in what we might send and what we might not. And so every major is differently, every school is different. We talked about that last point, which is don't list scores under Common App unless you want every college that you're applying to on Common App to see it. You maybe like, if you know that there's a school that you're likely to get into, maybe you will submit scores because it puts you in a good spot. But if it's a reach school where the scores are often higher, maybe you'll withhold. Some examples here. So here's a student who has well, actually, I don't think we have, this is more just the range. So it's middle 50th percentile, meaning 50% of students who got in this year, so the 25th to 75th percentiles, were in these ranges. So verbal was between 680 and 750, math 700 to close to perfect, which is a total of 1380 to 1540. So these are easily available online for most colleges. If you have a 1300, you have to make a decision. It's maybe not a good thing to decide to submit. 1400 is also even a close call. 1500 will be a slam dunk. We would submit that. Right? So looking at those ranges, just thinking about what makes you a good candidate. Typical rule, if you're in the bottom quartile, don't submit it. The gray area is a gray area, right? So if you're right in that 25th to 50th percentile, there are other considerations that come into play. And then anything above that, you're usually going to submit, especially if you're in the top quartile, of course. Like, that's going to make you look better. You will boost the profile of the college that you attend if your score is above their average. So that's what we're keeping in mind, right? Lower than 1380 will bring down their average. Higher than 1500 or 1540 will bring it up a little bit. So the score ranges for a couple of years ago might be skewed, and I feel like last year as well, of course. They've actually, like, so it's become more competitive. Scores now are higher. It's actually like the ranges that used to be for Georgia or for Emory are now higher. So like if you, a 30 would used to give you a pretty good shot for ACT, now it's a 32. It's hard to tell because, again, colleges are being clandestine about what they release and are not making permanent decisions. So you might have to look back a few years and really think about it. Contact admissions offices. There's no shame in that. It could be very helpful. In some colleges, so like Tulane, Franklin, Marshall, are kind of in this new spot. So their scores have gone up and now they're staying there. Some colleges will probably come back down, but it does seem like right now what's happened is just it's more competitive. You need higher scores to get into some of these more selective schools if you're going in the submitting pool. Look at Georgia as an example. From just 2020 to 2021, the middle quartiles went up 100 to 130 points in SAT, and then went up like a solid 3 to 5 points for the low to high range on ACT, 32 to 34 for UGA. I mean, that's amazing. They are accepting, obviously, quite a bit of students, or were accepting test optional, but now they're test required again, and these score ranges are still like up that high. So UGA just getting harder to get into every year for decades. Boston University, another example. I mean, now you have to be like between a 33 and 35 on ACT, right, or 98th, 99th percentile on SAT to be in the middle range for that school. Big shift. Question now is a 34 on ACT, which is 99th percentile. Is that not good enough for Penn? The answer might be, you might be better off submitting without. I still don't think so, but most people going to Penn have a 35 or 36 on ACT at this point. So pretty close to perfect. So yeah, what was a little bit ridiculous has become even more so in a lot of ways. Here are a few other ranges. So you can kind of see both the minimum and the maximum of these middle 50th percentile ranges going up. Emory, a 1390 used to be solid, now 1450 plus is what you're looking for. Ohio State, right, up about 40 or 30 points, depending on where you look. Michigan, the Harvard or the Midwest, up 60 on the bottom range and up 20 on the top. But 1400 to 1540, I mean, that's a really high score. So over the past couple of years, it has become more competitive. We just need higher scores in general. I'm going to leave time for question and answers. So actually on this last slide, the only other thing I want to point out, and I said this at the beginning, but even though this is the case and it's more and more competitive and the score ranges are higher, don't forget the background to all of that is that schools are test optional now. So that gives you more options. It gives us more strategy to consider. And it means that once you take those first round of tests, it's really a decision of, do I pursue test prep or not? Right. And like, obviously I'm biased in a way. I'm a tutor for SAT, ACT prep, but I'm very aware that it's not for everyone. And so some students now can decide early, I'm not going to take these tests and grind it out. I'm not going to spend all my time on this. Instead, I'll focus on other aspects of my resume, both work and school and schedule and all that. So that's, I think, the takeaway is test scores don't define us. It's a big part of the picture, but we've got more options now than we used to. I'm just going to talk to you about a few things coming up. So I will let you guys go by the end of the hour. Something that started, I believe, last night, maybe tomorrow. Last night, part 1 of this webinar series was Brain Science 101. We've got a couple more coming up though. So on Wednesdays later this month, how to prepare, so study skills, something a lot of my students really need. And then Moment of Brilliance, how to show what you know. You can reserve a spot at that website below. Those are free. I guess I shouldn't say that for sure. I think they are. And then PSAT prep rallies. So one of the big things coming up for juniors is what's most important for is middle of October on a Wednesday, take the PSAT, which is really not important for most people, but for high scorers, it can get you some really major scholarships, including national merit. So regardless, it's good prep for SAT and just testing in general. But there's some reading and writing sessions with expert tutors, PSAT practice tests, which are pretty much like an SAT practice test. And you can register for any and all of those sessions. You can see the website there. And finally, we've got a sale coming up September 19th, September 30th for academic tutoring. So we not only do test prep and APs, but also school subjects. So if your student's struggling with calculus BC and needs a few rounds of tutoring, there's a sale coming up. All right, that does it for me. I would say if you have any questions today, please shoot them in the Q&A. We'll take a minute to answer those. Any broader questions, feel free to email Applerouth, info@applerouth.com, or call the number below. We've got a great team. Most of our client services team are or were tutors, so they really know their stuff. And if you're interested in tutoring, I would go to the website, just check it out. You can request to work with me. I'm a premium tutor online. We also have in-person options in various locations. First question I have is, what is a good website or app to study for ACT and SAT? That is a good question. I've got a few answers. So for SAT, Khan Academy's good, pretty good. They link to all the official SAT practice tests that have been released, and they have some benchmarks. So Khan Academy is a good one for SAT. Applerouth Online is amazing. It's new, and I'm biased, but our instructional design team is incredible. So there's an Applerouth Online program for each section of each test that breaks it down into exercises, quizzes, videos. I'm also partial to the Applerouth book. Our SAT guides are really good, ACT guides. There aren't that many good ACT websites to study for. I think probably your best move there would be find some practice tests and then just make sure you're checking answers and learning from them. So yeah, very much more so there are SAT resources available than ACT. Yeah, Khan Academy, Applerouth website, and then just doing practice tests and working with somebody, whether it's classmates or a tutor or a parent, to figure out what are you missing and why. Good question. I'll leave it open for a couple more minutes to see if anyone else has questions about ACT, SAT, college applications, or other. And it looks like we may not have any, which hopefully means I've answered your questions. I appreciate everyone joining tonight. It's been a pleasure. And I hope you guys have a great rest of the evening.